even the monitors who were appointed to look after the order and morality of the whole school. 2 theologians generally arranged the conditions of the battle, whether each class should split into 2 sides or whether all pupils should divide themselves in 2 halves. In each case, the grammarians began the battle, and after the rhetoricians had joined in, the former retired and stood on the benches in order to watch the fortunes of the fray. Then came the philosophers with long black mustaches, and finally the thick-necked theologians. The battle generally ended in a victory for the latter, and the philosophers retired to the different classrooms, rubbing their aching limbs and throwing themselves in the benches to take breath. When the teacher, who in his own time had taken part in such contests, entered the classroom, he saw by the heated faces of his pupils that the battle had been very severe, and while he canned the hands of the rhetoricians, in another room, another teacher did the same for the philosophers. On Sundays and festival days, the seminarists took puppet theaters to the citizens' houses. Sometimes they acted a comedy, and in that case it was always a theologian who took part of the hero or heroine, Potiphar or Herodias, etc. As a reward for their exhortations, they receive a piece of linen, a sack of maize, half a roast goose, or something similar. All students, lay and clerical, were very poorly provided with means for procuring themselves necessary subsistence, but at the same time very fond of eating, so that however much food was given to them, they were never satisfied, and the gifts bestowed by rich landowners were never adequate for their needs. Therefore, the commissariat committee, consisting of the philosophers and theologians, sometimes dispatched the grammarians and rhetoricians under the leadership of a philosopher, themselves sometimes joining in the expedition with sacks in their shoulders into the town in order to levy a contribution on the flesh pots of the citizens. And then there was a feast in the seminary. The most important event in the seminary year was the arrival of the holidays. These began in July, and then generally all the students went home. At that time, all the roads were thronged with grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians, who had no home of his own, would take up his quarters with some fellow student's family, and the philosophers and theologians look out for tutors' post, taught the children of rich farmers, and received for doing so a pair of new boots, and sometimes also a new coat. The whole troop of them would go off in close ranks like a regiment. They cooked their porridge in common and encamped under the open sky. Each had a bag with them containing a shirt and a pair of socks. The theologians were especially economical. In order not to wear out their boots too quickly, they took them off and carried them on a stick over their shoulders, especially when the road was very muddy. Then they tucked up their breeches over their knees and waded bravely through the pools and puddles. Whenever they spied in a village near the highway, they at once left it, approached the house which seemed the most considerable, and began with loud voices to sing a psalm. The master of the house, an old Cossack engaged in agriculture, would listen for a long time with his head popped in his hands, then with tears in his cheeks say to his wife, "What the students are singing sounds very devout. Bring out some lard and anything else of the kind we have in the house." After thus replenishing their stores, the students would continue their way. The farther they went, the smaller grew their numbers, and they dispersed into their various houses and left those whose homes were still farther on. On one occasion, during such a march, 3 students left in the main road in order to get provisions in some village, since their stock had long been exhausted. This party consisted of the theologian Calava, the philosopher Thomas Brutus, and the rhetorician Tiberius Gorobetz. The first was a tall youth with broad shoulders of a peculiar character. Everything which came within the reach of his fingers he felt obliged to appropriate. Moreover, he was of a very melancholy disposition, and when he got intoxicated, he hid himself in the most tangled thickets, so that the seminary officials had the greatest